and then the caller.
Usually you say hello.
I say hello.
Yeah.
Hello. Thanks for calling. What's your name?
My name's Grant.
Grant? Hi, Grant. I'm Mark.
Hey, Mark.
Sorry, what do you want to talk, Grant? What do you want to talk about today, man?
Yeah, so I understand that we prepare for physical performance with three things. You know, with strength training, which is very general, with practice, which is extremely specific,
right,
and then conditioning. And so my question,
I don't know that conditioning is the third wheel here, but let's go ahead. Maybe your question will reveal the problem with that assumption.
all right, so how specific should conditioning be to a given activity?
Well, conditioning in the general sense of the word means cardiovascular work at some level of intensity, right? Let's take the example of a weightlifting meet where there are 6 attempts on the platform. There's not really a conditioning component for that, is there? Because cardiovascular adaptations do not control the outcome of any of those attempts. I mean, even if you follow yourself on from second to third attempts, let's say you're real strong and you're operating at the top of the flight, you're going to have there's officially 2 minutes, and then it takes them to minute and a half to fuck around and load the bar because they're trying to buy you some time. So you've got 3 minutes between those 2 attempts. And 3 minutes does not represent a conditioning problem. 3 attempts or 3 minutes represents your attempt selection. Right? It reflects your ability to select correct attempts so that you can accurately predict your ability to make the third attempt, right? If you know you're going to follow yourself, and you typically do in these things, then you choose attempts that reflect the right amount of time between those attempts because you want to make the third attempt, right? You either want to make the third attempt or you made the second attempt and you don't need the third attempt. So it doesn't matter. So that's one extreme. The other extreme would be running a marathon, where you're so insane that you've decided to go run 26.2 miles. And conditioning is the entire preparation effort for this thing. There's some strategy involved and, not stepping on somebody else's toes during one of your 5-minute miles, that sort of thing. And somewhere in the middle is everything else. So the classic example is soccer. Okay, let's play a soccer game. Now, depending on your field position in soccer, if you're defenseman in the back by the goalie, you're not running around very much, and your efforts back there are a series of anaerobic bursts. Mini anaerobic bursts, little sprints to get to the ball, right? Now, if you're a forward, halfbacks, whatever they call them now, you're running quite a bit more, right? So there's both of those require conditioning, but that conditioning is provided by practice. Because what is soccer practice? It's playing soccer, right? And so we conduct practice in a way that, hopefully if it's conducted correctly, provides the conditioning that is specific to the game. It's specific to the game because we're acquiring it during practice. Now, if you practice 3 days a week and you play a game on Saturday, that's 4 conditioning exposures that are specific to, not just to the game of soccer, but to your field position. So, in other words, a lot of the time, I'd say a lot of the time. Conditioning for the event is provided by the practice component. So really, there are only two components, and that's training and practice, and the two-factor model provides for both of these. If you just step back and understand what practice involves.
Conditioning is part of the first factor. Conditioning falls under training.
Conditioning falls under training, sure, but it's provided for by the practice. You see what I mean?
So really, this is grounded for me from. So I box. I'm a boxer, and I'm, the thing I notice first, strength is fine. Working through the program, and I know how to practice, but I just get gassed, very, very quickly. So is it really just going to be a matter of doing it over and over and over until it becomes easier?
How are you practicing? Are you running road work? They used to call it in boxing. Those guys have been very reluctant to give up on jogging. I don't know how jogging provides for the conditioning that a 3-minute rounds would provide.
And a 3-minute round is 50 10-second rounds, so it's not really a 3-minute round.
Right.
So think about
anaerobic bursts.
So look, here's your answer. You're familiar with our book, Practical Programming, yes? Okay, so on the cover of that book, there's the graph that shows the performance curve and the law of diminishing returns and all that. So conditioning follows that same trajectory, even though that's about strength. But if you think of conditioning along that same path, when you are new at a sport, doing the sport will provide sufficient conditioning. As you do the sport more and more, and as you become better conditioned, your conditioning will have to be more specific and individualized. So what that means in practical terms is, as you get more efficient at boxing, as you get better skilled at boxing, the boxing provides a base level of conditioning. But if you need to push further ahead on that performance curve in terms of conditioning, you'll have to figure out a way to make the conditioning apply to boxing, not interfere with strength, and also be stressful enough to produce an adaptation.
Right. 5-minute rounds instead of 3.
Hit the bag harder.
Hit the bag in 5-minute rounds.
Hit the bag harder. And then, if you need to do stuff outside of the sport, then you use the thing that's the most efficient and easiest and least taxing in terms of wear and tear on your joints, which would be something like a prowler or an Airdyne or something.
Now, here's another important thing to keep in mind with respect to that diminishing returns curve. That thing on the cover of the book is specific to strength training. And you'll see that curve covers a very long period of time, years, right? Conditioning is different. The shape of the curve is the same, but the adaptation comes on much, much, much more quickly. It's not structural. It's a metabolic adaptation. In other words, we're changing the chemistry in the structures that are already there, right? It also goes away very, very quickly, all right? And this is why you're familiar with two-a-days in high school football, right? 2 weeks, they train you two-a-days, and they beat the piss out of you, and amazingly enough, 2 weeks later, you're in pretty good shape because it's a conditioning stress, and conditioning is adapted to quickly, but you lose a conditioning adaptation very quickly as well. This is what is wrong with the military conditioning all year round, all right? It comes on quickly. You get to where you can run 5 miles in a fairly short period of time. But continuing to run 5 miles once the adaptation has already set in is extremely counterproductive for strength training because it fixes it up so you can't recover from your strength training. All right, this is what's wrong with CrossFit. It's the same thing. You can't get strong doing CrossFit because the constant emphasis on conditioning is a competing adaptation for strength. And everybody is aware of the fact that strength is more beneficial for the vast majority of tasks except for the 26.2 thing, right? So strength training needs to take priority. Conditioning is provided for, typically for most sports, by practicing the sport. There are exceptions to that, and there are situations where a little more conditioning must be done. But to answer
rare.
your original
it's extremely
question,
rare.
Conditioning falls under training in that both of them are accumulated physiologic adaptations. They are not skill. But in the case of soccer and in most other sports, tennis, racquetball, fencing,
Boxing.
the practice of the sport provides the conditioning aspect of the accumulation of physiologic adaptation. So we're still back to the 2-factor model. It's not a 3-factor model.
When you're talking about sports, especially anything really, anything that's not long distance running, the strength and the conditioning part are intertwined. So don't forget that. You can't separate the two out. And what I mean by that is as you get stronger, because people think they're either working on conditioning or they're working on strength. As you get stronger, what happens to your ability to do conditioning? Whether it's doing the sport, hitting the heavy bag, or if you choose to do some other shit for conditioning. But what happens to your ability to hit the bag harder, to push the prowler harder? You're increasing. I don't know if you guys remember, like 10 years ago, work capacity was the buzzword. But what happens to your ability to tax your system as you get stronger, as your deadlift goes from 2 to 3 to 4 to 500 pounds? You can hit the bag harder, and therefore every bout of conditioning within your sport
is more
stressful, and you get better conditioned because of that. So strength always takes priority. The sport is the second is the other thing that you're practicing in terms of the 2-factor, and then conditioning just comes along for the ride. If you find 3 years into your sport that your practice is not enough to get you where you're not gassed, you either need to get more efficient with your technique, or you might need to add a little bit of stuff. But
you might need to pay more attention to your diet, because a lot of that terminal endurance stuff has to do with what you ate that day, and that can't be emphasized enough. If you go into a 3-hour football game having not prepared your blood sugar levels to get you through the thing, you're fucking up.
Sure,
man.
of course.
You have to pay attention to all aspects of this. But if practice is being conducted correctly, generally speaking, practice provides the conditioning aspect of training. Okay? Thanks for the call. Now, see how productive that was?
That was a good one.
Allowed us to flesh out our thinking on the 2-factor model, which is a very important contribution that we have made to the literature. Isn't that interesting that we made that contribution?
I didn't make that contribution.
Well,
I don't know about we.
I made it, but I mean we, the Asgard company, our little community here, we made that contribution. Wasn't ex-phys school that made that contribution?
Aside from
Wasn't ex-phys?
No. Aside from the obvious things in the book and the moment model and all that, the 2-factor thing is the most important thing we talk about.
It is, because it applies
to everything.
It applies to everything, and it allows you to make accurate programming decisions. If you'll analyze the sport against the 2-factor model, it sorts it all out for you. It's incredibly important, and I don't think anybody's appreciated that yet, but maybe one of these days. One of these days it'll show up in an ex-phys text, and it'll probably be credited to, Kramer or Garhammer or somebody. Certainly not me.